Imagine that suddenly everything you know is taken from you. The place where you live, where your children play, where your family feels safe, now it's under threat. The streets that once echoed with laughter and joy are now empty, filled with dust and darkness. You hear the heavy sound of soldiers' boots marching, the clashing of swords being drawn, and screams slicing through the air like knives. The fear of being caught, of seeing your home burn, of losing everything you love. This was the terror that the Jews faced during the Jewish-Roman Wars. Imagine looking to the horizon and seeing a cloud of dust raised by the approaching Roman army, like a storm devouring everything in its path. The soldiers show no mercy, and you know that if you don't fight back, everything you cherish will be destroyed. What would you do? How would you protect your family when it feels like the entire world is crumbling around you? In this video, I will tell you the true story of these battles that lasted for decades. You will discover how an entire people stood against the most powerful empire in the world, even when all hope seemed lost. And most importantly, I'll reveal how, even amidst fear, hunger, and devastation, they found the strength to resist and stand firm. If you've ever felt like everything is against you, that there's no way out, this video will show you how a people turn their despair into courage. Stay with me until the end, because the key to facing fear, even in the darkest moments, lies hidden within the lessons of these historic battles. Let's embark on this journey together. You are not alone. If you think you know Roman history, just wait until you hear what's coming next. The clash between the Jews and the mighty Roman Empire was far more intense and brutal than you can imagine. Stay tuned, because we are about to unveil the secrets and most shocking moments of these epic battles. Don't go anywhere. You're about to discover details that Rome tried to erase from history. Imagine a rich and prosperous land called Judea, which was part of the powerful Roman Empire. It was a place full of crops, bustling trade, and everything seemed to be going well there. But suddenly the atmosphere began to change. The Jewish people, who had lived there for so long, began to feel suffocated by the Romans. They resented being controlled by an empire so distant and different from them. And it was around the year 66 AD that something monumental began. The Jews grew tired of being commanded by Rome and decided to fight for their freedom. The Jews' decision to rise against the Romans had serious consequences. During these battles known as the Jewish-Roman Wars, the most important city for the Jews, Jerusalem, ended up being destroyed. Just imagine, the people living there were forced to leave their homes, their streets, and their temples behind. Many of them fled to far-off places spreading across the world. It was a deeply tragic moment, as it meant that the Jews lost their homeland and had to find new places to live, far away from everything they knew. Tensions escalated between the Jews and Romans for several reasons. First, the Jews were extremely upset because the Romans began interfering with their religious beliefs and traditions. Imagine someone from outside coming in and trying to dictate how you should celebrate your holidays or how you should pray. This sparked an explosive conflict that changed the course of history forever. It did not sit well with the Jews, especially when the Romans decided to appoint the religious leader of the temple in Jerusalem, which was the most sacred place for them. For the Jews, it was as if someone had invaded their home and started changing everything without permission. They felt that their religious freedom was being stripped away, and this only made them even more determined to fight for their independence. To the Romans, this Jewish rebellion was like a huge headache. They believed the Jews were being disobedient and causing trouble for the empire's order. The Romans thought that maintaining peace meant everyone had to follow their rules, and they did not take kindly to seeing the Jews rebel. So for them, quelling this revolt was more than just a matter of control. It was a way to show that no one could challenge their authority. Thus they came with all their might, using the army to crush any resistance, paying little attention to what the Jews felt or believed. The Jews, on the other hand, felt as if they were being treated like second-class citizens. Imagine living in your own home, but always being treated like an unwelcome guest. Ever since the Romans had taken over Judea in 63 BC, the Jews were forced to pay heavy taxes, while the money they earned barely covered their basic needs. To make matters worse, the Romans were constantly watching, controlling, and even interfering in decisions that should have belonged solely to the Jews. While they allowed the Jews to keep their own culture and religion, it was like a false sense of freedom. There was always a Roman looking over their shoulder, ready to interfere whenever they wished. This only left the people more frustrated and prepared to fight. The situation grew even worse when the Roman procurator, Gessius Florus, took charge of Judea. He was like a corrupt and greedy boss. To give you an idea, imagine a leader who only thinks about taking advantage of everyone. Florus did everything he could to amass more wealth, caring nothing for the people's suffering. In one of the most shocking episodes, he even stole a large sum of money from the treasury of the temple in Jerusalem, which was sacred to the Jews. This was like throwing a spark into a barrel of gunpowder. The people were furious, feeling it was the last straw. They had stolen their freedom, and now they were even robbing their faith. That was when many Jews decided they could no longer bear the Romans' presence in their land. What made things even worse was when the tension between Jews and Romans escalated into street fights. In a shocking incident, while Jews were gathered in prayer at a synagogue, some Greeks, supported by the Romans, did something deeply disrespectful. They sacrificed birds right at the synagogue's entrance, rendering the place impure for the Jews. They were outraged and they went to Florus, hoping he would do something. But instead of helping, he simply accepted a bribe and had all the Jews who complained arrested. That was the last straw. The Jewish people realized that the Roman authorities didn't care about them and only wanted to push them aside. That's when many decided to take up arms and fight for real. From that moment on, the revolt spiraled out of control. The poorer Jews were tired of working hard only to see their profits taken by the Romans to enrich the elite. Life was becoming increasingly difficult for them. Judea was a land filled with conflict, and the people suffered from poverty and high taxes. Imagine toiling every day to harvest your crops or tend to your livestock, only to have most of your earnings taken away by the Romans. They felt exploited, and over time, that frustration turned into hatred and a desire for rebellion. The situation had grown so dire that by the year 66, when they finally decided to rebel, the people were more united than ever to fight for their freedom. In this atmosphere of revolt, a group called the Zealots gained strength. They were like warriors determined to drive the Romans out of Judea, no matter the cost. For them, there was no middle ground. Anyone siding with the Romans, even fellow Jews, was seen as a traitor. These Zealots were so fearless that in a surprise attack, they managed to defeat a group of Roman soldiers in Jerusalem, which boosted the morale of the people. But of course, the Roman Empire wasn't going to let that slide. Emperor Nero sent one of his best generals, Vespasian, and his son Titus, with a massive army to crush the revolt. It was as if a giant had been awakened, now marching to extinguish any hope the Jews had left. Yet despite this, the rebels did not give up and were determined to fight to the bitter end, defending every inch of land with tooth and nail. The battle between the Jews and the Romans was incredibly uneven. Imagine facing a massive, well-trained army, clad in gleaming armor and wielding powerful weapons, while you and your friends had to fight with old swords and hastily made spears. The Romans had about 100,000 soldiers, while the Jews could only muster around 60,000, most of whom were ordinary people who had never fought before. The Romans, on top of everything, also had warships and more advanced weapons, giving them a significant advantage. Yet the Jews fought with everything they had. They used their survival skills, knew the land well, and set up ambushes whenever they could. Every Jew who took up arms knew they were fighting for their home, their faith, and their people. But despite all that courage, the difference in strength was too great for them to hold out for long. When the Romans arrived with their full might, many Jewish leaders realized that the situation was becoming desperate. Flavius Josephus, a key Jewish commander, tried to resist, leading a group of rebels in the city of Jotapata. But after a prolonged siege, he was eventually captured. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of being killed, Josephus switched sides and began aiding the Romans as an advisor. Meanwhile, the Romans started marching toward Jerusalem, and the atmosphere in the city quickly shifted from hope to fear. The more peaceful leaders tried to convince the Zealots to surrender, thinking it was better to save lives than to continue a hopeless fight. But the Zealots were determined to fight to the bitter end, believing that it was better to die free than to submit once again to Roman rule. And so, as the enemy approached, the Jews, they prepared to defend their city with everything they had, even knowing the odds were against them. The situation in Jerusalem was getting worse by the day. With the Romans surrounding the city, it didn't take long before food and water began to run out. Imagine being trapped inside your own home, with towering walls enclosing you on all sides, unable to step outside to even find food, while outside, a massive army waits to attack. People began to starve, and despair consumed the city. But as if the threat of the Romans outside wasn't enough, inside the city the Jews were also divided. The Zealots refused to surrender, while other groups, simply wanting to survive, were willing to negotiate with the Romans. These groups started fighting among themselves, which only made things worse. There was so much chaos that instead of uniting against a common enemy, the Jews were fighting each other, further weakening their chances of resistance. Meanwhile, Titus, the Roman general, decided it was time to launch a full-scale assault. He surrounded Jerusalem with walls so that no one could escape. Anyone who tried to leave the city was captured and cruelly crucified outside the walls to terrify those still inside. It was as if he was saying, "No one is getting out of here alive." Conditions inside Jerusalem became unbearable. As battles raged in the streets, despair consumed everyone. Determined to win, Titus began using brutal tactics. Amid all this chaos, a radical group known as the Sicarii stood out. They were like shadows moving through the city and eliminating anyone they deemed a traitor. To them, any Jew who suggested a deal with the Romans was an enemy. With the city surrounded and the people starving, Titus decided to make a final attack. He concentrated his forces on destroying the Antonia fortress, which was near the temple, the heart of Jewish faith. The defenders tried everything to stop the advance, but the Romans were relentless. Slowly, Titus and his army gained more and more control. Finally, in September of the year 70 AD, the Temple of Jerusalem was set ablaze. The flames rose high, lighting up the night and leaving the Jewish people devastated. For them, losing the temple was like having a part of their soul torn away. Without the temple, Jerusalem was in ruins. It was the end of a long and painful resistance. The city, once a symbol of Jewish pride, was now completely destroyed. Even with the fall of Jerusalem, the war was not yet over. Some Jews, determined to continue the fight, took refuge in remote fortresses. The most famous of these fortresses was Masada, a stronghold on top of an isolated cliff, nearly impossible to reach. There, a group of zealots and Sicarii, led by Eleazar ben Yair, decided to resist to the last man. The Romans, now led by General Lucius Flavius Silva, surrounded Masada, but they knew it would not be easy to breach that nearly unreachable fortress. So they used all their military engineering skills to build a massive ramp of earth and stones, allowing their siege machines to reach Masada's high walls. It was a long and exhausting task, but the Romans were determined not to let any rebels escape. Inside the fortress, the Jews knew the end was near. When the Romans finally breached the walls, Eleazar delivered a powerful speech, convincing his followers that it was better to die free than to be captured and enslaved. And so, in a final act of desperation and courage, the defenders of Masada chose to take their own lives, preferring death over Roman enslavement. When the Romans finally entered, they found a deathly silence. Everyone had chosen to die together, free rather than surrender. It was a tragic end, but one that became a symbol of resistance and courage for the Jewish people for generations. Even after the fall of Masada, the conflicts between the Jews and the Romans did not completely end. Nearly 60 years later, a final major revolt erupted in Judea. This rebellion became known. How the Bar Kokhba revolt was one of the most desperate attempts by the Jewish people to reclaim their freedom. It all began when Emperor Hadrian decided to transform Jerusalem into a Roman city, complete with temples dedicated to Roman gods. For the Jews, this was an unforgivable insult. They had already lost their city and temple, but now they had to watch a new pagan temple being erected right where the sacred temple of Jerusalem once stood. This was the final straw. Leading this new revolt was Simon Bar Kokhba, whom many Jews believed to be the Messiah who would free them from Roman rule. He was a charismatic and skilled leader who employed guerrilla tactics to strike at Roman garrisons. With the support of Rabbi Akiva, who proclaimed him as the Prince of Israel, many Jews rallied to his cause. At first, Bar Kokhba achieved some surprising victories, managing to retake several cities and defeat Roman legions. But the empire responded by sending massive reinforcements. Hadrian brought in experienced legions from other parts of the empire to crush the rebellion. The battles were fierce, with the Jews using tunnels and ambushes to fight against Roman forces. However, the resistance could not last forever. In the end, the superior strength of the Roman army prevailed. The fortress of Batar, the rebels' last stronghold, fell in 135 AD, marking the end of the revolt. It was a terrible massacre. Thousands of Jews were killed, including Bar Kokhba himself. After this defeat, Emperor Hadrian banned Jews from Jerusalem and sought to erase any trace of Jewish culture in the region. As a result, the Jews were scattered even further across the world, entering a diaspora that would last for centuries. The land that had once been their home now became a place where they were forbidden to live. And thus the hopes for freedom of the Jewish people were crushed, leaving deep scars in their history. Even after the brutal end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Empire was not satisfied. Emperor Hadrian decided that it was necessary to completely erase any trace of Jewish identity in Judea to prevent future uprisings. He transformed Jerusalem into a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina and banned Jews from entering the city under penalty of death. For them, it was as if the city that had once been the heart of their faith had now become forbidden territory. Hadrian also did everything he could to stifle Jewish culture and religion. He banned the practice of religious traditions and destroyed what was left of their ancient institutions. Even circumcising their sons, a fundamental practice for Jews, became a crime. Hadrian wanted the Jews to be assimilated into the empire and to forget their identity. The few Jews who remained in the region were forced to live in small villages, always under surveillance, while Roman legions remained on standby to crush any attempt at revolt. This new policy was a devastating blow to the Jewish people, who, in addition to losing their land, also saw their faith and traditions being attacked. This forced dispersion by the Roman Empire marked the beginning of a long period of diaspora, during which the Jews were compelled to live scattered around the world, without a country to call their own. Yet wherever they went, the Jews kept alive the hope of one day returning to their promised land, praying and passing down their traditions from generation to generation. What Hadrian failed to understand was that, despite all this oppression, the faith and resilience of the Jewish people could not be destroyed. They carried with them their stories, their prayers, and the promise to never abandon their roots. And although Judea had been erased from Roman maps, it continued to live on in the hearts and memories of its people for centuries. The Roman repression had lasting consequences for the Jews, not only in the Holy Land, but also in various other regions of the Roman Empire. After the final defeat, many Jews who were not killed or enslaved fled to places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even the Iberian Peninsula. Wherever they went, they carried with them the pain of having lost their land and the determination to keep their identity alive. However, the revolt and its aftermath did not only affect the Jews. The Roman Empire was also deeply impacted. The uprisings, especially the Bar Kokhba revolt, were so intense that they forced Rome to mobilize vast amounts of soldiers and resources, weakening its position in other parts of the empire. This in turn contributed to Rome facing serious challenges along its borders with other peoples, such as the Parthians and the Germanic tribes, only a few decades later. Did you feel the intensity of these battles? Roman history is full of mysteries and twists, and these wars deeply shaped the destiny of an entire people. If you enjoyed this journey through Roman history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming documentaries. We still have many incredible and little-known stories from Roman history to share with you. See you next time.